Welcome, good afternoon. I'm Sharon Farb, the Associate University Librarian and Chief Policy Strategist for the UCLA Library, and it is my great privilege and honor to welcome all of you, and I want to thank our esteemed panelists who you'll get to know in just a few minutes, but also to everyone here who took the time to come. Thank you all so much. Yay, seriously. For those of you just joining, there's a sign up in the back and there's food in the back. Please make yourself at home, grab some food. Before we start, I'd like to do the land acknowledgement. UCLA Library acknowledged the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tovaangar, the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. For those of you joining us from elsewhere, please check out whose land you are on and honor that. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives in relations past, present, and emerging. Today's program, which is part of a series, is kicked off yesterday, and there's several more coming up, including our final one, which is a showcase of student work, so I hope you all come back and join us for that one. It's also an in-person event. Today's program, Diasporic Spaces, Places, and Connections in Los Angeles, my favorite city, is part of the series Diasporas, Transnational Migrations, Spaces, and Identities. The series aims to explore diasporas from around the world from various lenses, personal stories, academic research, community endeavors, and art. In order to provide a better understanding of the experiences of migrants, their descendants in creating community, negotiating identity, and preserving and transforming cultural traditions. Moderating today's journey is one of our favorite professors here, along with others, Professor Abel Valenzuela. He's the interim dean of the Division of Social Sciences. He's a professor of labor studies, urban planning, Chicana, Central American studies here at UCLA. His research interests include precarious labor markets, worker centers, immigrant workers, and Los Angeles. In addition to the topic of today, Professor Valenzuela has published numerous articles on immigrant settlement, labor market outcomes, urban poverty, inequality, and continues to frame national public and policy conversations on immigrant and low-wage workers. It is my great pleasure to have Abel come up, kick us off, introduce the esteemed panelists we have today, and also I want to give a shout out to everyone who has helped us organize this program. It takes a village, as you might imagine, and also give a shout out to the ASUCLA who's here today and has some books for sale from some of our folks who are presenting, so I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. Without further ado, my friend, over to you.
Hi, everybody. It's really good to be in this space. Even walking here from Murphy was a delight, right? Because there's students, the sun is glorious. We were talking a little bit about possibly taking a drive outside of our city or even within our city to look at the lovely spring sort of blooms and colors going on, right? One of the unique things of our region, though something we've been missing in part because of the drought. Let me begin by welcoming and thanking all of you for being here. And of course, I want to thank our organizers. You know, in many ways, returning back to campus in person, we're trying to do things better, including feeding and convenings. And we're still a little bit rusty, but this seems pretty well done. It seems really, in my opinion, flawless. And I think our panelists are just amazing. So I think we're in for a great, great treat. So I thank all of you for being here and the organizers. Let me say a few comments, some context. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Mexico City. They no longer call it DF. And I was there for a celebration. It was UCLA's centennial pre-pandemic, and we had lots of activities planned, and they were cut short. And so this was a makeup, and I was asked to join the chancellor and a few other folks. And they asked me to give a 6-minute sort of TED talk. And so I came up with something, and they said, you know, talk about your journey, talk about UCLA, and then talk about the impact. And so I thought about this, and I came up with the title. It was called UC Los Angeles, right? And then I wrote colon, I see the world. And then I went forward to talk about my own background, my parents' journey to Los Angeles, my mother crossing the border from Ciudad Juarez to attend a Methodist elementary school that's still open, eventually moving with my grandparents to Watsonville, failing terribly picking strawberries, right? Something we kind of hide in shame, right? And then settling in Los Angeles, where my father then met my mother, and he came as a young man from Mexico. So there was this immigrant connection that was formidable. But that was, you know, many years ago. This was, you know, about 60 years ago. And our city has changed, and it's obviously much more than this experience that I'm just sharing, right? And it involves so many other sorts of spaces. Los Angeles has a rich topography, right? Filled with neighborhoods and spaces, and a lot of the research that many of us do, not only on this campus, but outside of the academy, in many ways tries to understand the interconnections that our city has. And they're there, and they're real. They're strengthened by our engagements. But there's also other issues that permeate our city as a result of this rich topography, right? And some of the basics like food, art, and culture have a wonderful way, I think, of blending and giving us a sense of not only belonging, but our soul. They nurture us. They help us deal with, if you will, some of the urban topography that can also be very isolating, very difficult. And so it's wonderful that today's panel, in many ways, privileges, I think, not only this rich topography of Los Angeles, but really makes specific efforts to address the arts, right? Culture, and do so in very different ways. And so we're in for a really big treat today. Let me begin by introducing our speakers. The first speaker I know really well, Rocio Rosales. She was a student here at UCLA. We actually worked together, and so I'm just thrilled to death when I was asked to do this and I saw her name. I actually teach her book as recently as last summer, and I've done so for the past 3 years. As a result, I have 2 new PhD students, one that's looking at tamales, right? Street vending tamales. There's a real science behind the production of tamales throughout the city of LA. Rocio's helping her think that through, as well as myself and others. There's a second student doing similar work. So the contributions are long-standing, and it helps us better understand these interactions in our city. So our first speaker is an associate professor of sociology at UC Irvine, and she'll be talking to us a little bit about her book, Fruteros. It's a wonderful piece of scholarship, and I want to salute her for that as well. Followed by Rocio will be Edina Leković, who is a community scholar in residence in the Islamic Studies Program here at UCLA, Tovaangar land. She's also executive director of the Robert Ellis Simon Foundation, and so she'll be sharing with us her work related to different waves of Muslim growth in this area, something that many of us perhaps don't pay enough attention to. It's a rich community that has only seen growth in this area. Following will be Sophia Armen. who is a community organizer and co-director of the Armenian-American Action Network. She's also a doctoral student here, at UC San Diego in ethnic studies, where some of us share friends and colleagues and collaborations. And then following will be Phung Huynh, who I think I connected, and it made sense when I was thinking about what I might say about her. She made reference to her son visiting Dios, and if you look at her great cowboy boots, you can see some influence perhaps here in Los Angeles. And so it was nice to hear about her work, and I think you'll all be impressed with some of the artistic and cultural artifacts that in part she will share. So she is an artist and a professor of art here at Los Angeles Valley College. So that is our distinguished panel. We'll follow in order. And then I have a few questions, but really, I think you all should drive the conversation. And so I will try to manage the Q&A. But our speakers, I've told them, really do have a green light to draw on their experience and take some of the nuances and clues from the audience in terms of their comments and follow up. So let's begin by having Professor Rosales share with us her contributions. Thank you.
I was joking with Abel that he's actually heard this presentation so often that he could probably give it. I don't think that you mentioned that you were also on my dissertation committee. Oh. I TA'd for you.
I'm a big fan, I really am. I just didn't, she has to have her own identity.
Our research interests are an overlapping Venn diagram, but I came to this project, as I said, I was a graduate student in sociology here, and I wanted to be an urban ethnographer. And I luckily was in a wonderful city to do that, right? I looked all around and I thought, if the city itself is my laboratory, where do I want to focus? And of course, I came to graduate school with interest in immigrant workers, in the informal economy, in this idea of hustling, to work. And my first year here, I took an ethnography class with the professor who went on to become my dissertation chair, Stefan Timmermans. And as part of that class, I started visiting street vendors on corners all across Los Angeles. And I didn't have a car the entire time that I was a graduate student here, so I would take the bus to, down Pico, down Olympic.
Your scooter?
I had my scooter later. I had my bicycle. And the project for that class ended up being really fascinating to me, right? Because it touched on all the things that I was interested in. Immigrants, hustling, Latinos. One of the reasons why I would go and hang out on the street corner so often was so that I could speak Spanish, so that I could get away from the graduate seminar space. And so the farther east I would go in the city, the more comfortable and at peace I felt. And I would love my time with the vendors. Once I talked to my dissertation chair about possibly making this my dissertation and not just my class project, he gave me the green light. And so because I started so early, I was able to take 6 years of my graduate career just hanging out with vendors. And I was able to write a book about them many years later. Books take a long time. I want to start with what vendors are. Of course, now they've come to represent something very iconic, right? Representative of the city, the rainbow-colored umbrellas dot our urban landscape. And oftentimes we walk past these vendors and maybe think about what they're selling or where they're selling, but we don't often think of who they are and what they represent. And I think that's what I wanted my book to do, to linger on the individuals underneath these umbrellas and tell their story. So in the book, not only do I spend time with them on the street corners of Los Angeles, but towards the end of the book, I talk about going to Puebla to visit their family members, their moms, their dads, their kids, everybody they left behind, to see what changed with their departure. And so it really is a trans-border connection book that I try to write. The presence of Ruteros on street corners throughout the city, of course, represent a confluence of really large economic forces. They are labor migrants who have crossed international borders in search of improved economic opportunities. But because most of the vendors that I followed are undocumented, they confront obstacles that prevent them from legally participating in the formal economy. Now, I want to share a quick anecdote that I opened the book with. Jesus was the first frutero that I visited regularly and befriended. He was clearly perplexed at my presence in the beginning. I asked too many questions and stood too close to him because the constant din of traffic, would obscure what he was saying. He was soft-spoken and his responses were barely audible. He was 21 years old when I met him in 2006. He was slender, dark-skinned, with a wispy-haired mustache and goatee. One of the first conversations we had went like this. I asked him, "Do you work every day?" And he said, "I keep bank hours." I had a puzzled face, and with his knife, he gestured toward the bank that he was standing in front of. And he said that he worked 6 days a week, reduced hours on Saturdays, and was closed on Sundays. I thought that was hilarious and ingenious, and I hadn't seen the infrastructure of the city before he pointed it out to me. His location on the sidewalk was not random. It was very deliberate. And so he allowed me to see the city in a completely different way. One day, after a couple of months of visits, I went to visit Jesus, and I didn't find him on a street corner. Along the curb next to the sidewalk where he usually parked his pushcart, I saw a melting pile of crushed ice. Had I just missed him? It was a Salvadoran parking lot attendant who answered all of my pressing questions. The health department had done a sweep. They had dumped his produce into large trash bags. Before confiscating his pushcart, they had asked him to dump all the remaining ice on the sidewalk. Did they arrest him? I asked, thinking immediately that it could be related to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I was told Jesus had been given a ticket and he was picked up by his friends shortly after. "I don't understand," I said in my conversation with this parking lot attendant. The attendant just shrugged and said bluntly, "It's illegal to be a street vendor." At that point, I had no sense of how crackdowns work or how often they occurred. I was immediately full of questions. The questions I had only scratched the surface of the complicated relationship that street vendors had with the city then and now. But in the time that I spent with the vendors, what proved more interesting was a paisano network that helped vendors withstand this and other assaults on their economic and social well-being. And it was that complicated web of relations between paisanos, so compatriots, that captured my sociological attention. As I said, many of the fruit vendors are from Puebla, and not only from Puebla. I would say most of the fruit vendors in the city of Los Angeles and now Long Beach, where I live, are from one town in Puebla, population 1,200. They're part of this network. Now, here's a mapping of all the vendors that I followed throughout my time doing fieldwork. And this is at the beginning of the book, showing my relationships, how they were each related to each other. As you can see, a lot of them come from Dos Mundos Puebla, which is a pseudonym that I gave this small town that they're from. In this network, I realized that there are bosses and there are employees. There are also labor recruiters and coyotes. Gerardo, for example, was both a labor recruiter and a coyote, and he was central to the concentration of vendors from Puebla. He helped recruit, transport, and along with his family in LA, he would employ many young men from Dos Mundos to be vendors in Los Angeles. So it was not uncommon for a vendor to leave this small town in Puebla knowing that they were going to be a fruit vendor in Los Angeles. And in fact, one vendor I talked to said, "I crossed over on a Friday, and on Monday morning, I was working on a street corner here." Amazing, right? I had no idea that all of this was happening. I had no idea that so many of them were recently arrived immigrants. But I was beginning to understand the importance of street vending in the context of recently arrived immigrants. In our collective imagination, we might turn to turn-of-the-century New York and think about immigrant street peddlers. And sure, New York has a lot of street vendors. But while New York has an estimated 20,000 street vendors selling food, flowers, book, art, Los Angeles has 50,000 street vendors, of which about 10,000 sell food, and of which 1,000 are fruteros. So on any given day in the city of Los Angeles, 1,000 fruteros fan out all across the city, which is why when you drive anywhere, you're likely to pass one of them along one of the major corridors. Now, what's interesting though, is that despite these numbers, throughout my time in the field, Los Angeles was the largest American city that prohibited street vending. This prohibition often resulted in the confiscation of push carts, fines, citations, sometimes arrest. Sometimes an arrest of a vendor might trigger an immigration and customs enforcement hold, which might then lead to deportation. So it's not inconsequential how these immigrants were policed and surveilled. And I always thought it was fascinating that they were engaging in a quote unquote illicit activity, but part of the job necessitated that they be public and visible on a corner, right? So how do you do both? How do you maintain the public presence to get customers, but the privacy to hide when crackdowns occur? Throughout my time in the field, it was not uncommon to hear vendors working on street corners just days after arriving in the country. At the end of the workday, as I rode around in a pickup truck with Cristian and Carmen, two of my main interlocutors, as we hauled the push carts to a storage warehouse comisaria, they would honk and nod to their fellow fruteros working on street corners. All the street corners that we passed. And Carmen, very quickly in the truck, would give me a quick description of everyone that we passed. That guy works for Raul. He's only been here a few weeks. That guy doesn't know how to hold a knife yet. He's so new. He just got here. He's from Dos Mundos too. Cristian was from Dos Mundos. And although I didn't select this population of workers knowing they would be such recent arrivals and in an occupation heavily networked with paisanos, those characteristics proved important when scrutinizing the impact of social networks. Because remember, I'm still an academic, right? And I'm deep in immigrant scholarship, and immigrant scholarship is all about social networks and what they provide to recent arrivals. Now, I gained entree into the vendor social world slowly by visiting individual vendors in distinct neighborhoods throughout the city between 2006 and 2012. And I still remain in contact with them because we're all Facebook friends and Instagram friends and every other social network friend that you can be. I continuously interviewed vendors on the street and then in their homes. I did 22 formal interviews, but they represent conversations that we would have across years. The majority of the vendors that I approached were young, Spanish-speaking Latino men, because this demographic was overrepresented among fruteros, maybe not so much among street vendors because you see many women. They were also primarily from the Mexican state of Puebla and a town that I call Dos Mundos. Throughout the 6 years in the field, I interviewed other individuals who touched upon the lives of vendors. I interviewed the owner of the wholesale fruit market in the produce district. I interviewed their parents in Mexico in 2011 and 2017. Abel, thank you so much for that grant that I received that allowed me to visit. And then in Mexico, I conducted 15 interviews with vendors. But that visit to Mexico allowed me to see where they were from, to walk the unpaved streets, and it made me understand the vendors' lives in a whole new light, to know where they were from. Now, the gist of my book, it focuses on immigrant fruteros, but tells the story of an ethnic community in challenging times. It is an account of their lives as migrants, as workers, and as members of an ethnic community. And it's a story of immigrant adaptation among entrepreneurial newcomers in a hostile context of reception. Now, I say that because we think that Los Angeles is friendly towards immigrants. Los Angeles has all kinds of immigrant communities. But because of this anti-vending law, it was distinctly hostile towards immigrants because many of the street vendors in Los Angeles are from immigrant communities. That's why I call Los Angeles a hostile context of reception, right? Because they have anti-immigrant and anti-poverty legislation that puts immigrants' lives at risk. Now, in the book, I talk about the paisano ties, the hometown connection that many of these vendors have, and how those ties to each other come to define their work and personal lives in powerful and meaningful ways. But, and this is my scholarly intervention, in a way that contradicts how migration scholars have conceptualized immigrant networks. So migration scholars in sociology have long documented how newcomers lean on their community of paisanos for help upon arrival. Immigrant social networks and the social capital that they provide sources of support. And we know this, the positive functions of these networks are well known. They might provide food, housing, work, everything that we know that eases a transition into a whole new country and a whole new life. But in my work, I move beyond how immigrants get jobs using their networks and instead focus on how these social networks both build and bind paisanos and the community. A focus on the positive functions of immigrant networks can often flatten really complex narratives and obscure the exploitative undercurrents that also constitute it. And so in my book, I wanted to tell that really complicated story. Relationships between people we know are complicated, they're dynamic, and it's unrealistic to assume that ties between individuals offer only benefits, especially when vulnerabilities related to context of reception, immigration status, class, and gender are present. So in my work, and this is the book and I hope you buy it, it's over there, I conceptualize what is happening among these vendors as the ethnic cage. And this is to make sense of both the benefits of social networks and the detriments of social networks and the social capital. And in the book, I talk about the ethnic cage in this way. For some, I say the ethnic cage is large and invisible, and it functions to corral community while keeping threats at bay. For others, the ethnic cage is small, visible, and functions to confine the individual while that same community does harm. Yet as I show throughout my book, the ethnic cage can serve different functions at different times for the same individual, because we know that personal, social, and work relationships are dynamic. The Mexican immigrants in my study opened doors to newcomers, both to offer help and to exploit. This is the ethnic cage. Newcomers are not turned away. Their paisanaje grants them entry, but it doesn't guarantee benevolence. Like others before me who stumbled on unsavory aspects of immigrant life, this is not the story that I set out to tell, but I did want to tell the complicated story of life for immigrants in Los Angeles. Fieldwork across several years revealed the structural hardship inspired, how it inspired ingenuity among fruteros, how this ingenuity often helped some and harmed others. And across the years, I was able to see both the promise and pain of community, which is what I hope this book captures. And so I will end there and hope that if you want to know more, you pick up the book. Thank you.
Let me welcome Edina.
Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, thank Rocio.
Hi everybody, my name is Edina Leković and I'm a proud Muslim Angelino, but I didn't start out as a Muslim Angelino. I grew up in San Diego, 2 hours south of here, because my parents made a choice to make home there. My parents are from the former Yugoslavia, and they chose to leave in 1970 after they were married for the reasons that a lot of immigrants leave their home countries, for better educational opportunities, better financial opportunities, and for religious freedom. My family has been Muslim for generations. We're part of the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, right, as Islam spread west. And so I start there with my story because just as when I was an undergrad here at UCLA in the late 90s, my feeling then and my feeling now is similar, which is that I look like every other white girl, but my experience is so much more complex than that. And I know that all of our experiences are so much more complex. And so I want to share with you what I have learned in the last year and a half, 2 years, about the history of Muslims in Los Angeles. I come from, when I was an undergrad here from 95 to 99, the highlight of my life was that I worked at the Daily Bruin all 4 years. I was the editor-in-chief my junior year, and I wore hijab. I started wearing hijab, which is the Muslim hair covering. And so I was the first Muslim with hijab in the country to run a college newspaper in 1997, 98. And that was a tipping point in time for a lot of Muslim life in Los Angeles and also in the US. Unfortunately, the Muslim community became known just a few years after that through the tragic, horrific news of 9/11. And too much of America and the world believes that Muslim history in the United States, or even here in Los Angeles, started right around that time. For me, as a Muslim myself and as a Muslim American who worked on the front lines of that post 9/11 activism, so I worked here from Los Angeles for a national Muslim advocacy group. And from 2000 to 2017, the 9/11 era. And that meant dealing with horrific news, bad media requests, because I was a communications director, and being robbed of the opportunity to tell our own stories on our own terms. People would get excited because they would see me on the news, or they'd introduce me by saying, oh, well, you might have seen her on the news. And I would always duck my head because it wasn't a point of pride for me. Because any time that I was on the news meant that there was bad news. Because that was the only time that Muslims were invited to even speak for themselves, and it was in the context of bad news, and to define and explain and defend and condemn and all of that kind of narrative. So walking out of that life and into my next chapter, what is important to me is to capture the stories of Muslim Los Angeles through the eyes, ears, hearts, mouths of Muslim Angelenos who have been through this experience. Now, my own assumption was that Muslim life in Los Angeles only went back to maybe 1950, because the mosque, the masjid that I was a part of after I graduated UCLA, which is called the Islamic Center of Southern California, I knew it started in the early 50s. And so that was my reference point. Well, I'm about to show you how much earlier our history goes, and a lot of this has just been captured by scholars in the last few years, and so I'll show you some of the texts that this comes from as well. So away we go. How many Muslims are in the United States? Well, the first studies of Muslims were done 6 years after 9/11. The academic and community curiosity about knowing ourselves was not that high until the context of bad news. And so by 2007, we know that there were 2.35 million Muslims in the United States, and by 2017, 3.45 million. So we're probably, it's inching up from there, of course, despite Donald Trump's Muslim ban and other programs that have gone on. But what is equally significant here is how much of this population is young, right? You're looking at adult versus youth populations, and the community skews young. And it's increasingly skewing younger, meaning that there are more and more first generation, the third generation, right, Muslim Americans rather than first generation. 3.5 million Muslims represents about 1% of the American population. So just as context. Here in California, about 1 million of those Muslims live here in California. We have the highest concentration of Muslims anywhere in the country. Here in Southern California, it's probably 600,000. And so this community, the best way I can describe it is that we reflect global Islam. Any Muslim community you're going to find in the world, you're going to find here in Los Angeles. Sometimes together, sometimes apart. And that's part of the story of Los Angeles as well. There's space to be together and space to be apart. Now, the story of migration to the United States starts with the horrific legacy of slavery. Omar ibn Said was kidnapped in Senegal and brought to the United States as an enslaved person when he was 30. He came from a family of Islamic scholars, and he was enslaved in North Carolina and South Carolina for the rest of his life. He spoke Arabic, wrote Arabic, and because of his enslavers' curiosities about him, he was eventually able to write his own autobiography, which is the first autobiography we have of any American Muslim, and it's written in Arabic. And so these are the earliest roots of Islam in the United States. And reflected here in Los Angeles recently through a new opera, particularly like this is, a great intersectional reality came to life. The LA Opera hosted this opera called Omar, based on the story of Omar ibn Said. And it was written by Rhiannon sorry, I just blanked on her last name. She is a folk singer from South Carolina who stumbled upon Omar ibn Said's story, and she wrote the opera along with an African-American composer who did the Get Out soundtrack and other stuff like that. So this is a Muslim story come to life here in Los Angeles and presented in this way. And the full circle or the full movement is again, for operating from a negative context for most of my adult life, this was a particularly proud moment. And it represents, again, the earliest stages of Muslim immigration, okay? Unfortunately, African Americans get cut out of the immigration story and the migration stories, but they will factor into the Muslim story here in Los Angeles. So I want to talk to you about the waves of migration. So like I said, I thought that our history started in 1950. Well, it turns out that Muslims have been in Los Angeles almost as long as Los Angeles has been a city of California in the new United States, or the newest state within the United States. The city became a city in 1849, and there are records from between 1855 and 1875 where the US military actually brought over a camel driver named Hajj Ali with his band of camels, and they brought him into Texas, and they used those camels to drive west across the desert, assuming that this would be an easier way. And this is some of the earliest supposed existence of Muslims. Haji Ali, who was later renamed Hajj Ali by his military handlers, had a long career and with his camels, and made it all the way to Los Angeles, got into some rabble-rousing, lost his way here, made back to Arizona, and eventually passed away in Arizona. There is a monument to Hajj Ali that exists where he is buried, and I forget which town in Arizona. But that's the earliest existence. Then, around the time of the Mexican Revolution, this is when the first sort of wave of immigration happens. And it is of Arabs. Arabs from Bilad Shams, as it's called, which is Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. We're all part of Bilad Shams. And now, what I learned in this journey is that those Palestinians, usually Palestinians and Syrians, they sometimes made multi-generational journeys to California. So often we think about the immigration stories as coming through Ellis Island. Well, the earliest existence of, for example, this family in the top left, Mansour Nahra and his wife Shafiqa, Mansour, his father came from Palestine to Mexico. And then when he was growing up and around the Mexican Revolution, he decided to move north. And he ended up in Los Angeles as a shopkeep owner in downtown. And this is him and his wife. They're seated left and right, Mansour and Shafiqa, and they're at the wedding of two employees who fell in love on the job and got married. And that's in 1929. Now, there were just as many Palestinian Christians who were coming to the United States at this time. There were actually more Palestinian Christians coming. And what was their business when they came? They were selling holy objects from the Holy Land, from Jerusalem. So with crosses and with other items that they brought, and that was part of the merchandise that they had. Arab Christians, there are more Arab Christians in the United States than there are Arab Muslims. And Arab Christians sort of set the track of folks moving north. Now, interestingly, you were talking about the border. In Arab Roots, one of the books I read, what she found is that some of these Palestinian immigrants would disguise their ethnic identity to be Mexican because they felt that they would have an easier time coming north. There was discrimination against Arab immigrants at Ellis Island, something about eye infection diseases, and they would use hooks to look under their eyelids and all of that kind of stuff. And so people made this other migration path. But because Arabs were still undesirable, some of them dressed as Mexicans and changed their names so it would make it easier for them to move north. So this is the first wave of immigration up until about 1925. Between 1900 and 1924, we also have immigrants from India and Mexico in the same way that we saw, again, more Arabs coming through, primarily Arabs coming through Mexico. We also had a group of about 2,000 men from the Punjab in India who were brought here as laborers for the forests and the land, but because of the racist laws, the miscegenation laws, as well as the Alien Acts as well, it made it in a situation where the Indian men, who were 10% of them were Muslim, that they couldn't bring their wives or families with them. And so these men, because they were not white, they couldn't own land because of the laws. And yet Mexican women could own land, but and so there was an introduction of convenience and mutual advantage that developed, that created the Punjab Mexicans, which is a community. There were dozens of Punjabi men who married Mexican women, and again, 10% of these men were Muslim, and the records show that they weren't that religious, but that they appreciated the Mexican women in their Catholicism because there was a strong faith that was involved there. And so these earliest waves fit right into the story of racism at the border, fit right into the stories of, of intersectional exclusion, and they had the hardest time creating lives here, and they worked around the laws. They often came to California for the same reason that other people did, which is that they could start over, do something different here. Now, we're coming back to African Americans who, through the Great Migration, began coming to California in larger numbers and Los Angeles in larger numbers between 1924 and 1964. Often we think about the Nation of Islam as being completely separate from Islam, and in those days it was. However, it was inspired by the same values of Islam. It's just that Elijah Muhammad added himself in as a prophet and changed some of the rituals. But the origins of the Nation of Islam were truly rooted in Islam, and the people who had survived slavery and their descendants trying to find their way back to Islam in a way that made sense to them. Okay, so African Americans migrate west. They start Nation of Islam chapters. The first Nation of Islam chapter is here in Los Angeles in the 1940s. I did an oral history interview with one of the daughter of one of the founders of Nation of Islam in Los Angeles. When she was 17, she was hired by Elijah Muhammad to serve as one of the 10 national secretaries. And the story of the Nation of Islam and its intersection with these other communities is what defines life after 1965. 1924 to 64 is also when we get, because of the laws, once again, we get educated immigrants starting to come. So because there was a shortage of doctors in the US, because all engineers, those kinds of professions, PhD students from India, from Pakistan, from across the Arab world started coming to the US. And so that's where we start to have more of the Muslim migration. This picture on the top left is the Islamic Foundation of Southern California, which was the first iteration of the Islamic Center of Southern California. It's one of the earliest immigrant-founded mosques, and it was in Koreatown. The Islamic Center of Southern California is still in Koreatown, and Koreatown is a hub of Muslim life for many different communities, including the Bangladeshi community, the Indonesian community, Vietnamese community, and many others. So 1965, of course, the Islamic Center started in 1951. That's the first earliest existence of a mosque. And while the Nation of Islam mosques are all African American and by the Nation of Islam code and conduct, the immigrant mosque that begins to be created, well, it's not homogenous. There are, you can't quite tell in a black and white picture, but we have Muslims from South Asia, from the Arab world, from Southeast Asia, and they have different forms of practice. They have different cultures. And so to get them all under one roof and consolidating their faith and offering their services in one language was a new thing. And it was also a place that, or the founders called a hospital for homesickness. A place where families could come together and feel that they were, together as Muslims, and that there was some community, and that their children didn't feel isolated and alone. And so that was one of the first iterations. Now, everything changes in 1965 because of the Civil Rights Act, but which also gave us the Immigration Act of 1965. And then that's why we have, all of the different Muslim communities that have come since. Okay, I'll share with this later. These are new texts. I want to just run you through here. This is just a small sample of the mosques that exist in Los Angeles. There are mosques that are multicultural, but there are also mosques that are single culture. And I want to just show you a couple of these. Masjid Bilal is in South LA, and it came directly out of the Nation of Islam. Temple number 27 became Masjid Bilal, and it's in the heart of South LA. They have a charter school on the property now too. The Islamic Center of Southern that's the Muslims for Progressive Values. Forget what you see on the top there. Muslims for Progressive Values is a new iteration of liberal Muslims who also want to cater to queer LGBTQ identifying Muslims and create space. So talking about places and spaces, there are new spaces being made for new needs. The Women's Mosque of America was also started here in Los Angeles in 2015. I got the great fortune of giving the first sermon there. And these are uniquely Los Angeles projects that are, impacting the world. The Islamic Center of Southern California, which I already mentioned, is hugely multicultural. They decided to make English their dominant and only language. All services are in English as the great common denominator, and American civic values are the Islamic Center's values because they correspond with Islam. Then there are other mosques that are more ethnically focused. There's a mosque for the Thai community. The King Fahd Mosque in Culver City was paid for by the government of Saudi Arabia. It has a more conservative leaning. This is an East African, South Asian Shia community in Santa Monica. And this is the Iranian Cultural Center and Muslim Center that's here in West LA and Palms. They each cater to their own, but they serve everyone at the same time. And this is what Muslim Los Angeles looks like today. You can follow LA Muslim History on Instagram. That's the page that I started to start sharing these gems, pictures, and ideas. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to note that we have 30 minutes left and we have 2 speakers. So please, Sophia Armen, you're next. And then that will be followed, of course, by Phung Huynh.
Can y'all hear me? Yes. Okay. All right, well, that's too bad because I was going to go into an Uncle Baba rant right now, but I guess I'm going to just go really quickly, okay? Does that seem good? I'll just start with this. My name is Sophia Armen. I'm actually coming up here as a community organizer, so pardon me, but I'm also going to use it to my advantage. I'm going to get to say the things that I want to say and talk about really what's at stake for our community right now. I also just want to begin by situating myself and my ancestors as I talk about this. And so I'm going to read a very short passage, extra short because we need to go on, just in an upcoming anthology that's a bunch of community organizers and scholars and art folks. So, where are you from? No, where are you really from? The first time a middle-aged white man yelled at me, "Get out and go back to your country," I froze. I was in the immediate days following 9/11. I was 9 years old and at my school. I didn't understand. I could not hold this stranger's well of hate in my body. I did not understand what he needed from me. I remember having 2 thoughts. One, while I clenched my fists, small fists, was no, no, no. That no was rage. The no I felt was important. It was one of the first times in my life I felt my power, the rejection of immorality and justice. It's the everyday feeling I get as I work in the community today, that it doesn't have to be this way for us, that these systems feel wrong. But something else happened that day. I heard my insides scream in anger, but then it came, a deep and unexplainable rush of sadness. It engulfed me, poured all over the contours of my young body. A second thought rushed to my head. Even though I was young, I remember I wanted to yell back at this man. I can't. It does not exist. Not really. So today I'm going to talk to you about Armenian-American experience and the way that it is incredibly abundant and full of many lives. And there's no way that you can actually, as anyone, come up and talk about an entire community. And I know all of us who come from communities where we're often given that burden, right, to either in a tokenized way or in the other way, right, to celebrate. There's no way to talk about this. We have great difference in our community just as we do outside of it. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about some erased histories that people don't often know about Armenians. And part of the hard part about that is that, as wonderful Aaron, my good friend who organized this book said, is that oftentimes we have to teach as we are also fighting for our civil rights, immigrant rights, and refugee rights struggles. So today we're going to talk about the ways that these things have circulated, and I'm sorry, but I'm not just going LA, even though I am a third generation Angelino. Three generations of Armenian Angelinos as part of my family, and actually part of them are also part of the folks who were stuck in Mexico, actually, because of the early immigration bans against Armenian refugees. But really, I'm going to talk about what this has looked like on the West Coast, especially because I just want to be honest, like there's a way not only that this gets erased, but I think it's erased intentionally because it actually divides and conquers in an important way in systems of racism. So first I want to say, I'm going to have to give you an intro. It's going to be short. Who are Armenians? Basics, because sometimes folks are struggling with it. So Armenians are a nation in West Asia. What does that mean? It means we're literally a nation. We actually cross borders in the same way that there are nations here that cross borders. We cross borders in what people consider the Middle East, or what we term as SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa, which is a decolonial term for this entire region. We continue generation after generation to face ongoing displacement, ongoing erasure, and ongoing dispossession. This is true, and if you find Armenian families in Los Angeles, many of them have multiple generations of displacement within one family in the US. I want to also say that scholars currently estimate there's up to 1 million Armenians in the United States, with the majority of them living here in Los Angeles. So when we talk about placing, that's part of the hard part, right? Is that it's actually really charged to say, where are you from? Because the reality is that we aren't just coming here as, quote, immigrants or migrants. We're also coming here as refugees, oftentimes over various generations to places that then are destroyed. So I want to name this, and I purposely have this without borders because I believe in a beautiful, liberated feminist future, right? Because people like me and my family who are exiles, right, actually quite literally deny these borders by our very existence. So where are we from? Largest concentration looks like this incredibly inaccurate but wonderful scribble. This is largely where Armenians find ancestry. And as I read for you, it means that we have really interesting and dynamic and multi-layered stories. And so here's like two parts of my family, for example. This is my Armenian family on the left, who's from Harput, which is literally an Armenian city in Turkey that no longer exists. And my other side, here's literally in the 1980s in Fresno, right? Actually, someone who was an Armenian Fedai who actually rebelled or fought against, quite literally as a guerrilla fighter, against oncoming massacres in his village. So many have heard about the Armenian genocide, but the reason why I have to name it is because it's actually a really big part of why we have a community that looks like how we do. Like, for example, Palestinians, we are some of the only communities in the United States where we have a bigger diaspora than our actual homeland. Now, that's hard for people to understand, but it actually really matters because a lot of our political organizing, a lot of our history in Los Angeles is actually the history of exiles and people who have been quite literally displaced as refugees. And you can pick any moment of Armenian history in the US, and that is true. So that is a constant, unfortunately, including to today. So this is not just statistics, and one thing I want to just name about this is an ongoing problem as we speak, actually, about really my community largely having not only our homeland disappeared, but actually having ideologies about that we are not native to this region be perpetuated and then picked up in diasporic spaces. And I'm only going to show you this quickly because right now in Turkey, what you're going to see Armenians in Los Angeles are doing, Armenians are doing the exact same thing in our homelands, all right? They're not only taking up space, they're preserving their culture, they're literally fighting as resistance through cultural arts, through political organizing with workers, with LGBT folks, with various marginalized communities throughout the Middle East. Okay, so let's start about the US. The United States had its largest mass immigration of Armenians to the US during the Armenian Genocide. This was not the first, but it was very large. Here's some of my family who came during this time. This time matters because actually wonderfully built on what Edina said, this had the entire region actually come at this time, largely Christian, as you mentioned, largely Lebanese and Armenian people who are coming from two major crises, which oftentimes don't get named. One of them is the Armenian and Assyrian genocide, which quite literally brings Assyrians and Armenians here, and also the forced famine of Mount Lebanon, which was basically a Turkish government-sponsored famine, which drove quite a lot of people who are considered from Beled el-Shams, but who you would think of today as like Lebanese. And that matters because they quite literally work together. They oftentimes organize together, and a lot of their, quote, Middle Eastern or Swana journals, newspapers, community organizations from this time look really similar, and it's not by coincidence. They were all quite literally immigrating together. They were displaced together. That's what that looked like. And I want to name the stakes of this. So I'm giving you some of this historical stuff because I'm also secretly a researcher, but I just want to name some of these things. Is that a lot of the headlines that you see from literally like 2 generations ago are also still happening now and also really relate to a lot of other communities. So here's one. First of all, by and large, there was structural state bans against peoples like Armenians, Arabs, and Assyrians during this time from coming to the US, okay? This was a refugee population. This was a population that many of the same tropes that we think of today in terms of anti-Muslim racism, Orientalism, anti-immigrant racism about these communities originate actually at this time. And the same tropes that people think of in the kind of East and imagining the East were things that Armenians were bumping up against over and over and over again. So much so that sadly, quite literally, it meant that people who had now fled for their lives, had nowhere to go because their villages were destroyed, came here and then were banned at the border. And this is important because I'm going to talk to you later about the Muslim ban, and it's basically the Muslim ban 0 right here. And why does this matter? Let's look at it. So 17 Armenians are killed after being deported at the border in the US when they're sent back to Turkey. And this should reign true today, right? This looks like a lot of our news headlines now, and it looks exactly like a lot of Armenians who are from Syria today, and when they're deported and they go back, and we can think of people like Assyrian Jimmy al-Dud, lots of folks who have this reality. This matters because the early Armenian communities in the US, specifically on the West Coast, also were trying not only to be refugees, but then somehow establish life, figure out how to run here, deal with it. And this is one family, the Kartosian family, who ends up being very famous because they achieve American citizenship for the Armenian-American communities right after the Syrian case, which is Dow versus United States. And here's some of their rug advertisements early on. And they were West Coast Armenians, and many people don't actually know their history because they continue to be erased as people. But they were Armenian genocide refugees, and up until now, no scholars have talked about this. Aliens being smuggled into US, drown in fog collision, another headline, right? Armenian refugees in a rowboat. Essentially, there were people who were scamming Armenian genocide refugees at the time, paying them to go on boats, and then sadly, lots of them lost their lives. Other things in the early Armenian community on the West Coast was rampant housing discrimination, rampant social, institutional discrimination. This is an ad, for example, in a newspaper where it says, if you can read it right here, where Asiatics are prohibited from securing property. No Armenians, no Japanese, no Chinese, no Asiatics, any kind can secure lots in this residence district. Racial covenants and also many forms of actually housing discrimination existed, and they were all about placing Armenians, Arabs, Iranians, Turks, Kurds within the Asian, anti-Asian exclusion framework. And this gets really desperate. Even after citizenship is won via whiteness, right, in the early 1900s, yeah, like literally a couple years later, right, the KKK bombs the Syrian family, and we can see that just because institutional citizenship is actually achieved, you see the ways in which citizenship for these peoples continues to be racialized up until today, which is an important thing that I just want to know, because people think this stuff starts like in 2001, and it doesn't, right, as we are seeing. All right, cool. But what did Armenians have been doing? Well, first of all, the early communities are really old in LA. Boyle Heights, like South Central, like these are places that have been Armenian for a long time, and they were started by refugee communities or ethnic enclaves. Here's a church on Slauson, if anyone knows where this is. This is St. James, and I just want to show you because it's a little secret. The top of this building is quite literally modeled off of Mount Ararat, which is our like symbol, Armenian community symbol, which is actually in Turkey, and once again, I don't have access to, Armenians don't have access to, even though it's been in their historic, kind of space. And if you look on it, you can always drive through and you can see it, and you can know that it's part of the mountain. Another form of this kind of early organizing was lots of newspaper journals. And this is not just unique to the Armenian community at the time. All Ottoman nationals and then folks post in the republics also had these amazing journals where they would talk about politics, just like we do today. They'd be like, we need an Armenian homeland, we need an Arab homeland, this is what we're gonna do. And so here's an example of one, Asparas. Okay, I know I'm going through 100 years of history, but I'm doing it quickly, so I gotta do it for you. Another major flashpoint is in the 1960s, okay? 1960s through 1980s. That's not to say that people didn't come in between, but another major mass immigration wave exists during then. That's also because many Armenians come, for example, from the Nakba, right? They come from the Lebanese Civil War, they come from the Iranian Revolution. And this is important to note because of the ways that Armenians are consistently put within minorities, within minorities, within minorities, but their histories continue to be erased, and thus our resources in the community are really impacted because we have people who are directly impacted, and because of racism in the US, people don't know how to even talk about the diversity of our communities, right? So Armenians have been, we're also refugees during this time, we're also immigrants, many of them also face the exact same kind of, quote, aliens, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment. And this is important because I really want to stress again, I'm a child of the War on Terror era. This is my coming up, I understand that. But for us to understand that we really come from a very long history of this and that this is systemic is actually really important for us as communities to understand and to build with each other. Okay, cool. Also though, even in the 60s, there were amazing Armenian organizers and continue to be. Oftentimes, they are hidden or erased. So for example, Charles Gary is actually named Charles Garabedian. Does anyone know who this is? Okay, this was the lawyer for the Black Panthers and like had quite a bunch of amazing organizing in his life. And he actually changed his name because he came from Fresno on the West Coast, where he faced a lot of anti-Armenian racism and tried to desperately assimilate and then use his power to actually be in the Black liberation struggle. Another one of those is Judy Northigan. She's on the left. People don't know this very famous Our Bodies Ourselves actually did have one Armenian who's consistently erased, who's part of it, and she was a really big part of early reproductive freedom conversations around people's bodies, especially for women. Okay, now we're here. So we can talk about now, like I'm gonna talk about actually the early 90s till now also. So part of my research, but also just part of what we do in Armenian-American Action Network, is we also deal with folks' actual direct issues and problems. One of them that was a big one was the Muslim ban, termed the Muslim ban, Executive Order 13769, which was by the Trump administration. But many people don't know that that ban actually was built on another ban. In the early 2000s, in 2001, 2002, there was a program called NSEERS. NSEERS was the Muslim ban prototype that essentially Obama furthered and then Trump actually took on. The Muslim ban, 1.0, NSEERS impacted a lot of Armenians and a lot of Armenian-Americans in specific, Armenians trying to come here. And so I've been doing research, ethnographies, and interviews with many of those Armenians. And one thing that I want to just mention is the way that not only are they not talked about in narratives or in like scholarly discourse, but quite literally the refugee agencies that are supposed to deal with folks and help people, the places and border checkpoints, right, which racialize people, all of these systems are compounded on top of them. And I just want to name this because it's something that continues to get lost and also that people want to erase as part of this, celebratory model minority discourse that exists. So I just want to name one, and I'm gonna end. Part of one of the folks who's a good friend who I interviewed, who's named Harag, talked about was how it's been essentially a really scary time. And I want to echo what you said, Edina. It's been a scary time to understand these things, and it's also revealed a lot of the ways that the United States system works and a lot of the ignorances about basic things around Swana communities, right? And how not only diverse this region is, but this region has lots of different people with lots of different needs who come here and then meet together. And so you could think of that as Orientalism, and I'm just gonna go on till the end. Okay, so I'll finish with this. Armenians now, as a community organizer, I will name this. Armenians face multiple and compounded issues within Los Angeles. We have had a series of hate crimes in Los Angeles in particular that I deal with, particularly in our work. And this has come from multiple things, from everything from dealing with quite literally state policy, there is anti-Middle Eastern policy, and also we face another threat, which is we are targeted ongoing by a Turkish nationalism within the US. I will, do I need to end?
Yes.
I must end. Okay, this is such a bummer because I have all the good stuff.
We have another.
Okay, no problem. I'll come back to all this, but we have a lot of beautiful history and I'm happy to share with you all. And all I'm gonna say is that we have been organizing against these and there's lots of LA wonderful people doing this. So I'll be sure to talk about that in the panel. Thank you. So sorry.
Hi everyone. Thank you for your patience in navigating and listening to all this wonderful material. And I'll let the art speak for itself. So I'm a Los Angeles-based artist, educator, and refugee, and a lot of that experience being displaced and having to assimilate is core to the work that I do. I always like to start with my baby picture because that's the beginning. It's a very unusual one. This is my baby photograph at a refugee camp in Thailand. Imagine that being your first experience. So my father's Cambodian and survived the genocide in Cambodia by biking his way to Vietnam, where he sought asylum and met my mom. So within 3 years, my father left his country, survived genocide, married somebody he couldn't communicate with, had to learn a new culture, had me, and then took 30 family members, extended and immediate, in a boat, under the boat's deck, and pretended to be a fisherman and took him to a refugee camp in Thailand. So these are drawings that I made of my parents. We were settled in Michigan in 1978. Imagine being Southeast Asian and never seeing snow at all. And like many of you, we learned to speak English and became American by watching TV as a family. Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers. And I would get annoyed that I had to translate for my grandparents. But before Hulu and Netflix, we also watch Chinese soap operas. A lot of my experience in assimilating was looking at plastic surgery and how it whitewashes Asian and Asian American women, and this is very common in communities of color. And you'll see that pervasive in advertisements, like this billboard, where you see a Northeast Asian woman, right, going through surgery, and you'll see her skin is lightened. She has double eyelid surgery, making her eyes bigger. She wears blue contacts, and her jaw is chiseled down to an angle. And what we see in plastic surgery also impacts products, like this one. It's a nose sharpener. I'm not making it up, right? This idea of assimilating, changing your body, making the nose less flat and more sharp. But what's problematic is, if you look at the product, it's a white woman advertising. So not only you're supposed to look prettier, but whiter. So that is a big, big research point in my work, and you'll see that where I twist all this American popular culture, but specifically how plastic surgery reshapes and whitewashes Asian women, and this has a long history of war. So I mentioned that my family survived the wars in Southeast Asia, so the very first introduction of whitewashing and plastic surgery came from an American military surgeon who performed double eyelid surgery on Korean women so that they would look more quote unquote attractive and occidental to American GIs. So I'll just show you a series of works. I made 30 drawings, paintings, and prints about this, where there's before and after images of plastic surgery on Asian women and this act of physical violence on our bodies. And then that shifted to wanting to make work about my family. So all of this assimilating, right, is very distant, but then I've always wanted to come up close to like how my family survived war and genocide, had to assimilate and become, and culturally erasure as well. So I started to make these snow globes of the war in Vietnam. Here we say the Vietnam War, it's really the American war in Vietnam. And I noticed that terrible Hollywood movies, American textbooks, never made space for people like me. They were told by white dominant culture. So I made these snow globes where you see iconic images in textbooks that you find in the Vietnam War, and contrasted that with personal family photos. Now we had to leave with only the clothes we had on, maybe an extra set or two, and we were very lucky to even have a few photos. So this is my mom at the age of 24 in a refugee camp in Thailand, sewing. Because as I was growing up, I was running out of clothes, and my mom took hers apart and resewed clothes for me. And in the snow globe, this is a picture of my godparents, who were Americans who sponsored us to come to the United States, and they're teaching my family how to build a snowman. But I remembered part of assimilation is playing with American toys, and how messed up it was that I would play with G.I. Joes. I would play with toys that looked like the perpetrators of violence in my home country. And racism as well. And toys and enacted racism, specifically anti-Asian racism and violence, is really, really played out in children and how they play. And Sophia kept saying naming. You know, my name is Phung, which means phoenix. It was given by my grandfather. When I got my citizenship, I had the choice to change my name and choose an anglicized name. I chose not to. And so I wanted to make work about folks who could never find their names, but also to recognize that there's a distinct difference between immigrants and refugees. I'm a refugee. So if it weren't for war and violence and American imperialism, I would not be here and my family would not choose to leave. And I just want to fast forward. You saw the images I made of my parents, and they're on pink donut boxes. You know, why are they on pink donut boxes? Because 90% of donut shops in California are owned and run by Cambodian immigrants and refugees. And again, this is part of assimilation and cultural erasure. We all know what a donut is. We all go buy donuts. But you don't know, or maybe people don't know, the family who runs these donut shops. So I started making portraits of Southeast Asian refugees, specifically Vietnamese and Cambodian, because that's my family's journey, and writing these stories through art. Because as we've seen time and time again, these stories are not written by us, they're written for us. And for me, art is a very important cultural voice and capital, and that's how I do it. But also during the genocide in Cambodia between 1975 and 1979, almost 30% of the population were eliminated and 90% of artists were eliminated. So the fact that I can be here today and talk to you about that and to make work about my community and my people and our resilience through art is really important. You've heard a lot from the panelists today about resilience and the migration story, and it's everywhere. And so I wanted to use the pink iconic box to talk about immigrant spaces and refugee spaces. Vainom means to sell donuts in Khmer, which is the language of Cambodians. But a lot of these donut shops are open 24 hours. So things like open 24 hours, ATM here, cash only, are specific languages used in immigrant and refugee spaces. So I wanted to highlight that. And I know we're very limited on time, so I just want to end with this last piece that I did recently. And if you visit the Venda Museum in Culver City, it's actually there right now. This piece is called Americanization, which is a wall installation of laminated drawings and collages that reflect upon diaspora, resettlement, and cultural assimilation and negotiation, which is why we are all here today. The artwork is an ironic reference to President Nixon's strategy, Vietnamization, which aimed to reduce American involvement in the Vietnam War by transferring all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. So Vietnamization was a deeply damaging process that tried to undo American involvement and resulted in violent chaos. When my family and I resettled in the United States in the small town of Mount Pleasant, Michigan in 1978, we were the first Southeast Asian family to arrive. So our Americanization experience was a confusing journey in navigating white dominant structures. We were labeled FOB, fresh off the boat. So the installation of drawings peels the layers of this complicated journey and includes the Vietnamese Madonna, Lady of Lavang, a Chinese cherub guised as a militant resistor, an old National Geographic magazine image of a Chinese woman in Shanghai getting a perm in 1980, and the juxtaposition of Chinese families in traditional clothing while holding the American flag and pledging allegiance. So this work encapsulates my Southeast Asian refugee experience lived through diaspora. Thank you.
So we have 2 minutes, so we don't have time to really field questions. What I would like to encourage, however, is for some of you or all of you to engage with our speakers individually, right? And perhaps use this space. But in terms of the official programming, we do have to be respectful of the time because that's what we do. So I want to thank our speakers for their thoughtful presentations. I think they're fabulous. Well done. And I want to thank all of you, and I'd like to adjourn us, but please come up here and engage with our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Double display. Yeah, and this matters.
So there's stuff that you guys can use.